see if I can work this.
You got it here too.
Hello. My daughter is here today. She's 10 years old, and I actually threatened to dance while on the stage for 30 minutes and say nothing the entire time, just in my ongoing quest to embarrass her. But I will spare all of us from that. What I am here to talk about today is the practice of extreme listening, and I have a bias in this. I have an agenda. I want all of you to walk away believing in this idea of extreme listening. I'm going to go through and describe it, how we put it into practice at the organization at which I work, but also the places where we see it being practiced out in the world that we might not always think of as listening very, very deeply. Before we get into more about it, let me just give you a little background about where this concept comes from. What you're looking at up here, well, I'm looking at it right there, but you're looking at it up there, is the Stanford Design School's design thinking methodology. How many of you are familiar with the concept of design thinking? So design thinking is a specific methodology for developing all kinds of products. It can be hotel lobbies or apps like we use it. It can be new faucets that you can actually figure out how to work in showers. You know, it can be all kinds of different things, but its hallmarks are the things that you see up on the slide, right? Whoever's version of it, it's very much about going in and seeing how people interact with space and things and one another, and then looking for solutions that will help make that interaction happen easier. So whenever we look at Stanford's process, right? And I could have gone and picked the process from MIT. And they have something very similar from their design school. Or the company IDEO that has pioneered a lot of the work around design thinking. They have a process that's very similar. So when you go in and look at it, you see extreme listening embedded into the steps, notably understand. Right? You can't understand unless you're listening deeply to what somebody's actually saying. This, of course, is something that librarians do all of the time, to be able to make recommendations of books, to be able to help, and guide teachers. But it's also something that needs to happen at community levels to design new interactions and new ways to help meet people's needs. So that concept of understanding, observe. I believe that watching is also a way of listening. It's seeing what people are doing. You're listening not just to their words, right? But you're actually watching how they interact with services and one another and observing that very carefully. And then the concept of prototype, which is often a very techie concept, this idea of a prototype. I always think of a prototype really just means something that you've gotten out the door and into other people's hands while you're still a little bit uncomfortable with it. You don't think it's done enough yet. And that's exactly when you want to get it out and people using it, because letting people touch it, whatever that may mean for a particular program or idea or project, let them wear off some of the rough edges and apply some of the shine, not you, so that you can see the places they most want to touch, And so I think that idea of being a little uncomfortable, like really feeling like, 2 more days, no. Get it out the door then and get feedback back, and that way of getting feedback is very much listening deeply. So also from Stanford's D School, which I did not attend and have no affiliation with, and actually I'm a Cal fan, so it's awful. But anyway, they employ this methodology throughout, right? So in part of understanding and observing, they talk about interviewing for empathy, right? And I think anytime we see that word empathy pop up, that's a clue that we're looking at something that's extreme listening. Because empathy is the ability to understand what somebody's saying despite your own biases. Ideally, to be able to understand it from their viewpoint and not your own. And so there are models and there are resources that help us to better be able to do that when we're thinking of program and project development. And they apply this to prototyping as well. We were talking about that just a little bit ago, but that idea that the point of prototyping is so you can see not are people using it the way I think they should be using it, whatever it is, right? But how are they really using it, right? In their context with their biases. So that's how we see it playing out in these different schools that are set up to teach us to use design thinking to make better products. We use it. Caravan Studios, the organization I work for, we're a nonprofit organization, a division of TechSoup Global, and we start all our projects with this idea of extreme listening, and the importance of it became so clear to me recently when we did some work with school-age youth in San Francisco about bullying. So here I am, this middle-aged white person, right, thinking we're going to talk about being mean to one another on Facebook, being snotty in the hallways at school, you know, derogatory slang. And I think these are all real problems. It's not that I don't think they're problems, but that is in fact not at all what they talked about. They talked about the systemic bullying of police force, of certain communities as a whole, and what that meant. They talked about the media glamorization of bullying on reality TV shows, where people bullied one another, particularly girls bullied one another to get the attention of a man. They had this nuance and this intelligence talking about it that I'm embarrassed to say, I did not foresee. You know, and I think that what I'm proud of is that we set up a way to listen so I could hear that despite the biases that I walked into the room with. And the preconceived notion, you know, a way of asking questions and talking to them and talking with them that let us hear what they were actually saying and not me just sort of trying to fit them into the box of what I wanted them to be saying. I'm also terrified of teenagers, so that was a little scary for me. But, and we also see this happening at in libraries around the world. So this project, Tonohedje, is in Brazil by an organization, IPR, and they're going out to different libraries in four different library systems. So very big systems like in Sao Paulo City, which is one of the biggest cities in the world, and in very small systems in the rural north of the country, where it's very poor and it's very, very different from most of what you would find in Sao Paulo. And they're working with the librarians to help understand how they make their libraries more inclusive of the community, right? And the way that they do this is what they call psychodrama. We would call it, I think, role-playing, because psychodrama has in English not such a good. And it is bringing together all of the people that are involved in the library, from administrators to professional library staff, to non-professional library staff, to janitors, security guards, different community members, and they set up role-playing so they have them all interact with one another from a different point of view so they can understand this. So when they did this in a community in Belém, in the northern part of the country, they discovered that a big negative for the library, something that was stopping all these people from even walking through the door, was the fact that the security guard had a visible gun, was wearing a black suit and sunglasses. And while the library staff thought it was denoting safety, that this is a safe place to be in a place that has violence and extreme poverty, that is not at all what much of the community saw. So the security guards started wearing colorful street clothes, the gun was not visible, and stopped wearing sunglasses, right? And the security guards suggested those changes based on this interaction. And I think that's what was remarkable about the work that they do there, is that they get people to see the other's viewpoint so clearly that they're able to make suggestions of what they should do differently, rather than feeling like they're forced into a different behavior. Another example of this, you may have seen this one, this is in New York State, and it's a video interaction. So you watch the video, this woman is talking to the librarian, and then you choose answers, you choose your next question, and then you know some different segment of the video goes through. And the point that they're trying to make with this video is an interesting one, right? It's the idea that we often think, oh, we treat everybody that comes in the same. But what can that mean for some community members? Treating them the same. They mean they have to express quite loudly in front of a line of other people that they're different in some significant way. That may not feel very good to them. And so this is a way to go through and ask questions and get different results for it. It's an interesting project. And then last, in Canada, they have something, the Working Together Community-Led Libraries Toolkit, which is very much a toolkit that's designed for inclusivity, right? And the idea that how do we change our services to be more accessible and meet more needs in a changing world, but also within changing communities and to meet the needs of different community members. It's an interesting toolkit. I think it's very applicable to a lot of work that actually many, I think, community-based organizations are doing, frankly, not just libraries, to think about how they can offer their services broadly. So those are places where I think we see this underpinning of extreme listening happen. The idea of inclusivity and cultural humility are interesting ones because they require us to listen closely as we think about how we're offering services to an individual or to a group of individuals within a community. So one of the things that I also strongly think with extreme listening, and it's very hard for me personally to put into place, is the idea that it's a practice. Nobody that is here is going to get up and run 135 miles like these people are doing through the California desert without maybe jogging around the block a couple times and building up and having their Saturday long runs and having tune-up races and getting there, right? Like the journey from standing in one place to being able to run an ultra marathon is a huge one. And you have to figure out what the milestones are along the way, but you can't go out and go for a 2-mile run on a treadmill and then think, okay, now I'm ready. You know, you have to keep doing it, and you have to set up and recognize the milestones. And I think I will say that is what I struggle with the most, because I want change to happen faster than that. I want to have learned something and be able to implement it faster than that. And I want to make a difference that I can turn around and show people so that they can help supercharge that difference faster than that. And so the practice of setting milestones along the way that you can communicate so that you can feel and see the change, but you can also communicate it to somebody else, is a tremendously difficult one. I think that runners have it. I run, and I think that I get it in the length of my long runs, right? Like I feel it when I go from running 3 miles to 8 miles. Like I can measure the difference. But on community projects, there's not like, I can't just hit a button on my watch and take off and see what I did differently that day, you know? And so understanding how to think about the milestones is tricky, and there's not just one answer, but I think it's an important part of any practice of extreme listening, because otherwise it's too easy to just stop. Because you can just see the gap between where you are and wherever it is you're trying to go. And I think if sports aren't your gig, you can apply it to meditating too. Like I could maybe, if forced, sit still for 2 minutes, right? Like and meditate. But like the idea, whenever I hear about some people talking about their meditation practice of doing it for an hour or on a guardrail next to a freeway, is beyond my imagination, and that's because you can't possibly go from 2 minutes to this, right, without having a lot of activity in between. So however you choose to think of it, I think figuring out what the steps are that basically allow you to reflect honestly on your progress, and to be able to share it and to get valuable encouragement from yourself and others is a big deal. So wonderful, we have ultra marathoners and monks meditating on guardrails, but what do you actually have to do to do some of this extreme listening? So I have some things that we're going to go through that are a helpful part of putting into practice. I will say that when I was thinking about this presentation, I tried to think about what are the things that we can do as individual professionals that can change us as a professional within the system, could possibly be applied to change the organization that we are in, and then possibly applied to change the bigger system we are a part of. Because everybody's going to have different circles of influence, and so it's hard when we see and work with. The reason we've come to know this project in Brazil that I was describing earlier is that we, at Caravan Studios, we have a project that's been funded by the Gates Global Library Foundation to do work in Brazil. And one of the things that has just really struck me is you see these people, librarians, and technical library staff, as well as non-professional librarians, all kinds of staff that can see and want to create the changes, but they're in such a system that they don't know how to create those changes. And so we have been thinking hard about how do we give them things to do that they can do, you can do differently even within a system while creating change. And part of it is so they can think about reasonable milestones. Because the milestone is unlikely to be that the Ministry of Culture completely changes in 2 months. You know, the library's got to have another smaller milestone. So when we think about some of those milestones, I will say the things that we think about have to do with the usage and uptake of certain programs, obviously, but also a lot about the demographics of the library, the hours the library is being used, the number of hours the library is being used. They think a lot about how many requests they get from the community, how many people pop up and say, oh, we want to be able to use the library for this, that the librarians didn't think of. That's a big sign of success for them, that they've made themselves open and available. So I think, again, figuring out what those milestones are and thinking about this along the way of doing these things that I'm about to go through is an important step. So the first thing that we do when we put in the practice of extreme listening any place is we identify the themes. You need to know what you're listening for. So we didn't just invite a bunch of San Francisco Bay Area teenagers into our office to talk about whatever they wanted to talk about. We invited them to come in and talk about anti-bullying and bullying issues. So we knew what we were listening for. They knew what they were there to talk about. We were able to bring in subject matter experts that were doing that work in the community to provide support for the conversation. But we knew very closely, very, very closely what we were listening for. We did, as a part of this step of identifying the themes, we also did research on it. We found out what kind of programs were in place in the various school districts around us, So we organized the material so that we were informed enough to listen well. Because I think that thing of both knowing what you're listening for and having enough information to be able to hear it, so it doesn't just slide by because you didn't know to see it, is an important component. Know who the people are, who's involved. And this really is like everyone that's involved. So when we thought about bullying, we thought about we found out which units of the police forces in the different counties dealt with bullying issues and how and where they did it in community policing. We found out about the nonprofit organizations that were doing work in this area, speakers. We looked for journalists that were writing about the issue. We found politicians and other government officials that had taken on the mantle in some visible and public way, right? We were looking at, as well as the students, as well as teachers, as well we learned as bus drivers on public transportation. Tragically and notably, there was an enormous issue of bullying on public transportation in the Bay Area, where a youth was set fire to. And so we realized that is a huge side of bullying, and the authority figure in that place is the person driving the bus, And so really looking at all of the people that are involved, because you have to understand everybody that can have influence on it. And I think it's easy to minimize the number of people and think of only the two people in the transaction. Right? The person bullying, the person being bullied, may be the authority figure that's there at that time. But you really have to think of all the people that are going to have influence on that within a community. And it's going to vary in different communities. You have to also know your constraints. And this is something that we hugely recommend people writing down as a list, one item after another on a piece of paper. And if that means typing it up and then hitting print, but somehow you actually record it. And the constraints are all the reasons it's hard in your community, right? Or the place you're working. Why isn't you've been using the anti-bullying? Why is that hard in the Bay Area? Why isn't it just a solved problem? You know, it could be another issue that we're very involved with is Kathy was talking about earlier, childhood hunger. Why isn't that, it is still, I have to say, somewhat astonishing to me that in the United States we're talking about childhood hunger. But we are, and why? Why isn't it easy to fix? And I think you're writing down all the things that are in that, whether you're talking about an issue of the kind I'm describing or, at my daughter's school, one of the big issues we face is an overcrowded lunchroom and the noise and chaos that results from that, and a school that's grown too big for its facilities, too big in student population for its facilities, and what does that mean? So that's still a know your constraints. What are our constraints to fixing that? Why can't we just go in and make the lunchroom bigger? And putting down all of those things from PTA willingness to building codes for schools are all constraints. And then once you've written them down, set them aside. Because you really have to know what they are. And in fact, knowing what they are can help you go back and realize that there were a few more people you needed to put on your who's involved list. But you can't let them stop you from going forward and trying to solve things. And that's one of the big things about writing them down and setting them aside, is so that they don't end up stopping you later, so that you're not carrying them around in your head. And every time you see a possibility, go, oh, well, that's impossible because of building codes. We've acknowledged the constraints. We're not acknowledging them, but we have to go forward and listen without always getting interrupted by why something is impossible. And then you also have to embody curiosity. And this happens in all kinds of ways, right? But mostly it happens in the willingness to ask questions. And to be able to ask genuinely interested in what the response is. Not because it's the next question on the sheet. And so that you're using an answer to inform your questions. And you're gathering information, and you're willing to take in information from unexpected things. Because often, extreme listening that changes us as professionals and changes the institutions within which we work, we're listening to all kinds of things. It's not just in places where we thought we were listening because we called up an expert to talk to them, or we're talking to a constituent or a user. You're going to hear an answer in all kinds of different and fascinating places once you start looking for it and you're curious to make connections. And then imagine the impossible. So this is why it's so important to know what your constraints are and the people that are involved. So this picture is of a mime on the streets of Bogota, Colombia. So in Bogota, they had this enormous problem with pedestrian deaths because of jaywalking. And so the mayor, they hired mimes to show up at the intersections of these busy streets and put up their mime wall, and to help stop people from crossing the street whenever it was dangerous and against the light. And this made such an enormous change, measurable change in the pedestrian deaths, that they started doing it in different cities in Venezuela. In Sao Paulo City in Brazil, they have a program where they hug people that are going to cross, so that they say you have a reason to live. And they do this, and while I love the story and I love the photos, what I love most about this is the idea of the police chief in Bogota, Colombia, putting pay mimes into his budget, like under public safety, right? And all the people that had to agree with that, like the city controller that's writing the check to the mimes, and just I love that idea that they were able to influence the people that they needed to influence to make an unexpected change. And this is an instance where writing down all the people involved and knowing who you have to sway so you can go in and do it to make change has such enormous value. I use this all the time when we're looking at things and thinking, well, there's no way we can do that. I'm like, Please cheap played mimes. We can figure this out. You know? And so you have to be willing to imagine that you can have influence. Because if you don't, and this is a place where we set the constraints aside, because if you don't, you're not going to be able to make, you're going to make incremental changes and you can make stuff better for sure, but you're not going to be able to get to the ultra marathon level. The other thing, this is a super interesting concept, the best ideas come after you have a swarm of ideas. So they've done these studies where they have this graph of people in brainstorming sessions, right? And it looks like slow, 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 picks up more ideas, more ideas, more ideas, and then it starts to dwindle and go back down again. And most people want to stop the brainstorming when they're up there on the peak, when they've collected the most ideas. But in fact, they've done studies that say the best ideas come on the downslope. They come whenever you think that you're done, when you sort of wrung out the towel and you're on the other end of it. And they've done study after study that demonstrates that. And I think the thing that we've learned is to keep the ideas coming. Don't be too fast to stop and start making things, but also to, and this is very much about the extreme listening and the idea of prototyping, is that's going to help you get a second wave of ideas, you know, that help inform and make things better. And then you also have to be hungry to know what happens next, because if you are hungry to be right or hungry to prove a point, it is super hard to get something out the door, man. It is super hard because it can always use more of something. But if you're hungry to know what happens next, it becomes so much easier to get projects into people's hands so that you can find out what they actually think, what human beings that aren't you actually think. One of the things I hate most, and it happens to me all the time, is I start confusing showing a PowerPoint to my colleagues with actual shipping. Like, that was work where we described an idea to one another in a conference room. Nobody but us knows about it yet. That is insufficient. It's not sufficient until people that aren't us and that we don't even know are using it and touching it. So my mother does not count, you know, like, because that's when we're going to start getting real feedback and find out what happens next. And that's what's going to force us to grow and change and listen harder. And this can be so uncomfortable. It can be so uncomfortable because you feel like you're getting stuff out the door so too early, and it can be uncomfortable because what people think of what you made or what you think of what you made can sometimes be dramatically different. And you have to be prepared to hear that and understand what to do with it. And then you just have to share wildly. You know, we have built into our general process, it sounds weird with extreme listening, but this process where we stop and reflect and we share. Because we find that process of organizing what we've heard and learned helps the listening take root. And that is the thing about extreme listening, I think, most, is that it takes root. And it changes us, and we hear it so clearly that we can't. I can no longer imagine thinking teenagers are only going to talk about Facebook snark as bullying, and that kind of change. We want to listen so that new viewpoint becomes a part of our own, and that's whenever we're really able, I think, to start changing our products and services. And that's all I have to say. So we've given, I think, 15 minutes, 10 minutes?
Yeah, we have about 12 minutes.
12 minutes. So we gave 15 minutes. I ate up 3 of them. We have 12 minutes for questioning. If there are no questions, I'm perfectly comfortable standing in uncomfortable silence.
Extreme listening.
I could dance. It's a good opportunity. Should they walk up to a mic stand? I think so, yes.
Yes.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that speech.
Thank you.
What I'm wondering is, we have dutifully gone through your 10 steps, which are very good. But those people or organizations that we come in contact with have haven't had the benefit of knowing your 10 steps. So how do you interact with them when they haven't done their homework?
We run into this all the time, actually, when we're building apps for communities. And there are a few things that we've seen to be true, is that our listening shows, because when we talk to people, they can hear that you really listen to what their community is and you're giving them a space to talk. So some of it is just by including them in that process. So for us, when we work with domestic violence service organizations, for example, it was to learn to always say survivor and never victim. To not assume that it's a woman. To not assume that there aren't other stresses in the family that may have nothing to do with a single point of anger in a man, right? Like there was all this stuff that showed up in the way that we talked about it that gave them an entry place for engagement. When we're talking, so that's how we've engaged other community members that maybe haven't gone through all of this. When we've engaged other decision makers, I find persistence to be an excellent tool. So whether that means, whatever that means, but to advocate for other people and other points of view can be very powerful to decision makers. And I think what we find is that's most often our first point of prototyping. In our case, it's going to a funder and asking for funding, right? It's our first point where we're describing the problem and we're getting feedback. And we try and think of it that way and just recognize we're going to have to do it a bunch. So it is about trying to apply that to the individual conversations and then letting it show that you've done your homework. And being prepared to do it again and again and again and again.